The first morning it happened, Nell figured the mule was just being Winston. That was what she called the behavior, being Winston, meaning impossible, unreasonable, and entirely pleased with himself about it. The old grey mule had a vocabulary of stubbornness that she had spent 11 years translating. He'd plant his feet in protest of flies. He'd balk at shadows. He'd stand at the gate and stare at something in the middle distance, like a philosopher who'd run out of conclusions. But this was different. Every morning that week, the moment she unclipped his lead from the paddock post and turned him toward the upper pasture, Winston swung his head to the left. Hard. Toward the old property line where the unused well sat behind a rusted wire fence overgrown with blackberry cane. She corrected him. He obeyed. Then, 40 feet down the path, he turned again. By Friday he was pulling, not drifting, pulling, like something at the end of a rope was reeling him in. Nell studied him the way her husband had always told her to study the land, without assumptions, and what she saw made the hair on her forearms rise. Winston wasn't being Winston. Winston was trying to tell her something. He just didn't have the words. If you've ever felt like something small was trying to get your attention, a detail, a sign, something easy to miss, then this story is for you. If you believe in watching carefully and listening to the land, hit subscribe and leave a like. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know. Nell Carver was 63 years old and had lived on this property in eastern Tennessee her entire adult life. She and her husband, Dale, had bought the 42 acres the year they married. They'd run a small beef operation together. Never big, never flashy, just enough. A tidy herd, a dependable hay crop, a pair of good fields that responded to rain like they were grateful for it. Dale had died 4 years ago. A heart attack. Quick, no drama, which was exactly how he would have wanted to go. What he left behind was the land, the debt, and a pasture that had been quietly losing ground ever since. The south field, the one below the tree line, had been the heart of their hay operation. 21 acres of reliable production. In the good years, they pulled 3 cuttings from it. Last summer, the yield had dropped to a number Nell still didn't like saying out loud. The grass came in thin and pale, the soil cracked by June. She'd paid 3 times her normal feed bill to keep the herd through a summer that should have carried them easily. She'd had 2 contractors walk the land. Both quoted her the same thing: irrigation, new system, new infrastructure, new debt. The lower figure she'd received was $18,000. She didn't have $18,000. She had Winston, a temperamental tractor, 40 head of cattle, and a south field that looked like it was quietly giving up. And now she had a mule who couldn't stop looking at an old well. The well had been on the property when they bought it. Stone-lined, hand-dug, almost certainly built in the 1890s, judging by the technique and the age of the coping stones. Dale had capped it with a wooden cover and wire mesh, their first spring on the property, because there'd been children visiting. Over the years, the blackberries had taken the fence. The cover had grayed and warped. Nobody had looked into it in 15 years, maybe 20. She asked her neighbor, Roy Metcalf, what he thought about the mule's behavior. Roy was 78 and had run cattle on the next ridge for 50 years. He leaned on the fence and watched Winston for a minute. "Smelling water," Roy said. "Dry spell pulls the moisture up from deeper down. Old wells breathe different when the water table's shifting. He's just smelling the cool air coming up." It made sense. Tennessee had been unusually dry that spring. She almost let it go. Then it rained. 3 inches in 2 days. The creek came up. The paddock held puddles for a week. Winston didn't stop. If anything, the rain made it worse. The morning after the second night of downpour, she found him pressed against his paddock fence, facing the old well, barely moving. His nostrils were working, his ears were cocked forward. He hadn't touched his grain. Roy's explanation didn't cover that. You didn't smell the absence of moisture more intensely when moisture was everywhere. Nell pulled on her rubber boots. She got the wire cutters from the barn. She almost didn't look directly into the well. She'd spent enough years on a working property to know that abandoned structures could mean wasps, or weak stone, or something dead at the bottom that would ruin her morning. She half expected to smell rot. Instead, she smelled cold. A deep, mineral cold rising from below, the kind that comes not from emptiness, but from depth, from earth that has never warmed, from water. She leaned over the stone coping and clicked on her flashlight. The beam traveled down 12 feet of mortared stone to the bottom, and the bottom wasn't dry. There was water, a thin, clear layer of it, and feeding into it from the north wall, at maybe 7 feet down, was a stone channel. Narrow, hand-cut, set into the wall at a slight angle. The kind of channel that wasn't designed to bring water up from below. It was designed to carry water in from somewhere else. Nell didn't know what she was looking at, but she knew it wasn't supposed to be there. She drove to the county recorder's office and asked for the oldest deed maps they had for her parcel. The clerk found a hand-drawn survey from 1912 folded into a manila envelope that hadn't been opened in decades. On that survey, running from the northeastern corner of the property down through the south field, directly through the struggling pasture, was a thin dashed line labeled Spring Branch, Gravity-Fed, Tile. A gravity-fed spring line. The old-timers who'd homesteaded that land hadn't drilled a well and pumped water uphill. They'd found a spring on the high ground at the property's edge, built a collection point, the stone-lined channel she'd seen inside the well, and run the water downhill through buried clay tile to distribute it across the south field. Passive irrigation. No pump, no electricity, no maintenance once the line was set. And it had fed that pasture, invisibly, for decades, until it stopped. She found a retired agricultural extension agent named Clyde Burris through a neighbor's recommendation. He was 70, semi-deaf, and immediately interested. He walked the property with her for 2 hours. He probed the soil with a narrow rod every 20 feet along the old survey line. 200 feet south of the well, the rod sank through soft earth and hit something hollow at 18 inches down. They dug. They found the old clay tile line, 4-inch pipe, original to the 1890s installation, and at that spot, a 30-foot section had collapsed inward. The tile was pancaked flat. Nothing could pass through. When did the south field start going soft in the wet years and cracking in the dry? Clyde asked. Nell thought. Gradual, she said. Maybe 8, 9 years ago. That's about right for this kind of break. Slow at first, then the soil above it settles and compresses the tile more each season. Eventually, nothing gets through. She looked at the crushed clay in her hand. This was why her pasture was dying. Not drought, not bad soil, not anything she'd done wrong. A 40-foot section of 100-year-old pipe had collapsed beneath her feet without a single visible sign on the surface. George Washington Carver once observed that where the soil is rich, the people flourish, physically and economically. What the old survey was teaching Nell was the harder version of that truth, that a field can look like it's failing while the thing keeping it alive is simply blocked, not gone. The water was still there. Clyde confirmed it. The spring was still running. She could see the proof in that thin, clear layer at the bottom of the old well. The spring was sending water down, the channel was receiving it, but the collapsed section was backing everything up and diverting it underground into the subsoil 20 feet north of where it needed to go. Repairing the section wouldn't cost $18,000. It would cost a weekend, a trenching rental, and $340 worth of modern clay tile from the building supply in town. But there was one serious problem. She didn't know how much the spring was still producing after a century of use and likely drought cycles. Fixing the line would mean nothing if the source had weakened to a trickle. She could spend the weekend digging and connect a pipe that moved 3 gallons a day across 21 acres. That was no irrigation system. That was a disappointment with extra steps. Clyde drove up to the springhead on the northeast corner and spent 40 minutes with a measuring bucket and a notebook. He came back without expression, which Nell had already learned was his version of good news. "She's still running," he said. "Enough." They trenched on a Saturday. Nell's youngest nephew came out from Knoxville to help. The ground smelled the way earth smells when it's been sealed away from air. Rich, cool, slightly sweet. They hit the old tile at 18 inches and followed the collapsed section until the pipe ran solid again in both directions. The new section went in before noon. Nell covered the trench. They tamped the soil. She stood beside the well and listened. For a long time, nothing. Then, faint, almost imagined, the sound of water moving through stone. She didn't celebrate, not yet. She walked the south field instead and watched the ground. The soil near the distribution end of the old line was still dry, still cracked. That wouldn't change today, but it changed. By the third week, there was a strip of noticeably darker soil running through the lower third of the pasture. By midsummer, the grass in that strip was 6 inches taller than the grass around it, and a deeper, heavier green. Her cattle figured it out before she did. They started grazing that section first, early in the morning, the way animals always move toward what's best. She didn't pull 3 cuttings that year, but she pulled 2 good ones from ground that had given her almost nothing the season before. Her feed bill dropped by more than half. She was leaning on the fence one evening, watching the south field in the low light, when Winston walked up beside her. He stood calmly. No pulling, no turning, no urgency in his ears or his feet. He rested his chin on the top rail and looked at the field the same way she did. The old well was 20 yards behind them, the same as it had always been. But something about the ground around it had changed. The blackberries weren't fighting as hard. The grass was coming in thicker near the stone coping. The air around it felt less abandoned. Nell thought about what Clyde had told her about why the mule had known. Mules, horses and donkeys have long been observed to locate water with unusual precision. They detect it through smell, the mineral compounds that groundwater carries to the surface. Through sound, the subsurface movement of water through stone and pipe, creating vibrations too low for human ears. Through moisture in the air rising from below. When a water system is partially blocked, the pressure changes. The air above it changes. The ground temperature above it changes. To a mule's senses, a blocked spring line and a functioning one feel entirely different. Winston hadn't been difficult. He'd been detecting something she had been too busy, too tired, and too certain of the wrong explanation to notice. The field hadn't been dying because it was done. It had been dying because something beneath it had been quietly blocked for years. Forgotten because nobody had thought to ask why something that had always worked had gradually stopped. Not every struggling piece of land is useless. Not every failing field needs to be replaced. Sometimes the answer is underground, behind a tangle of old wire, at the bottom of something nobody has looked into in 20 years. Observe carefully. Investigate before you assume. And if a stubborn animal keeps pulling you somewhere you haven't thought to look, maybe, once, let it lead.